So Pavarotti is at it again. This time he's trying to say they spliced Kohberger's dad's DNA into the sample from the knife sheath. Let's take a listen.
They couldn't get a complete profile because it's touch-degraded DNA. They couldn't get a complete profile. They couldn't get all the genomes needed to be able to successfully enter it into CODIS. They probably had enough of a profile to enter into CODIS, but it wouldn't have presented a match even if an assailant was in CODIS because it was an incomplete profile. However, they used this IgG secretive profile, the SNP profile, in a manner in which they say they got to Kohberger, but they won't produce results. What really happened was when they obtained the DNA out of Kohberger's father's trash, they then flew it back to the Idaho State Police lab, which makes no sense. They should have taken it to the local FBI lab, let them create the profile so that they could then match it. They didn't do that. They flew the sample, they flew the literal trash back to the Idaho State Police lab where they have the initial STR profile sitting. They took the trash, created a profile out of the trash of Kohberger's father, and then used genomes from Kohberger's father to insert it into the original STR profile to get a semi-complete profile. That way, when they got the buccal swab from Kohberger, it matched all right 5 octillion times as long as it's not an unrelated individual.
You really believe that, don't you? Well, let's just say this. I hope you don't really believe that. I hope you really aren't that stupid. They didn't add any genomes from his father to the DNA profile. Okay. They put his DNA into CODIS on November 20th, 2022. And then that DNA stayed in CODIS because it was a suspect profile. So they weren't just running it in there to see if they would get a match, but it was also uploaded because it was a suspect profile from a crime scene. So once it was uploaded in there, it stayed in there. So unless you're trying to say that they had his dad's genomes back on November 20th to splice into the DNA that they uploaded into CODIS, you're completely wrong. So let's take a look at the documents. Okay, this is for a motion for a protective order from the state. So Latah County prosecutor. So they are saying that law enforcement found the DNA of a potential suspect at the crime scene, and the FBI submitted the DNA to one or more publicly available genetic genealogy services to determine potential relatives of the suspect. The FBI then used common genealogy techniques to develop a family tree leading to the defendant. Okay, so the state was seeking, of course, to protect the names of everybody. But let's look a little further into this document. It says factual background. The Idaho State Police Lab in Meridian, Idaho, located DNA on the K-bar knife sheath. The ISP laboratory determined the DNA came from a single source, and that source was male. Once law enforcement had a single source DNA from the K-bar knife sheath, they conducted what is called short tandem repeat STR analysis. STR DNA analysis involves looking at 20 regions within the human DNA and allows law enforcement to make a direct comparison between two STR DNA profiles. Law enforcement submitted the STR DNA profile obtained from the K-bar knife sheath to the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, a database of STR DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and crime scene evidence to identify the source of the DNA. No match was found. Then, of course, unable to find the match, then that's when they sent it to Othram. Now, it goes on to say, prior to the FBI's IgG efforts, the ISP laboratory developed the traditional STR profile from the DNA found on the K-bar knife sheath. After identification of defendant, law enforcement recovered trash from the home of defendant's parrot. An ISP laboratory did an STR analysis of items from the trash for comparison to the unknown crime scene DNA. The comparison indicated the DNA found on the trash belonged to the biological father of the individual who left the DNA on the K-bar knife sheath. Pursuant to a search warrant, law enforcement then collected DNA from the defendant via a buccal swab. A traditional STR DNA comparison was done between the STR profile found on the K-bar knife sheath and the defendant's DNA. The comparison showed a statistical. So, we know they found DNA on the sheath. Now, it said it was touch DNA. That was brought up during a hearing. But we don't know how large the sample was. Nobody's ever said. Now, a lot of people have thought Bicca Barlow said, but what she was referring to was actually the case study that she had mentioned. So we don't know how big the Kohberger sample was. Now, touch DNA generally can be small, but sometimes it can be larger. Let's take a look. While many studies support DNA deposited by touch came from shed keratinocytes, several papers offer wider perspective identifying multiple sources as complete or partial skin cells, nucleated epithelial cells from other fluids or body parts in contacts with one's hands, i.e. saliva, sebum, sweat, or cell-free DNA, either endogenous or transferred onto contact region from the above-mentioned fluids. In particular, cell-free DNA has been proven to be a reliable source of genetic material, often generating higher yields than its cellular counterpart. Although considerable doubt remains about its origin, it is still unclear whether cell-free DNA is derived directly from bodily fluids or whether it's released after cellular degradation following touch deposition. So what that's saying is that touch or transfer DNA could actually yield larger sample sizes if there was bodily fluids mixed in with it. So sweat, if his hands were sweaty when he opened the sheath and those skin cells chafed off, you could have DNA in there from bodily secretions, and that would yield a larger amount. Also, some people are bigger shedders than others that would also yield a higher sample size. Let's take a look at that. So it says the concept of a good or bad shedder status, primarily introduced in 1999, is a person's propensity to deposit a high or low amount of DNA on a touched object, respectively. And it goes on saying, although biological and genetic factors affecting this status are largely unknown, age, sex, and certain activities, i.e. touching DNA-free objects, wearing gloves, rubbing fingers on body parts, seem to influence the deposited traces. Generally, men shed more DNA than women, especially younger males, compared to older ones. In contrast, physical activities involving sweating leads to an increase in DNA transfer. Closely related to this subject, body location impact results too. For example, sebaceous skin areas versus non-sebaceous, the dominant hand versus non-dominant, and fingertips versus palms, potential for the DNA deposits. And then it says biological evidence can be virtually left behind everywhere during criminal activities, i.e. from wooden murder weapons to metallic handle doors. Several authors have reported increased sloughed epithelial cells on rough and porous substrates, while non-porous substrates adhere to genetic material less readily. Thus, fabrics and cotton appear to be better collectors than plastic or glass surfaces. It has been proven more difficult to consistently recover DNA from metal surfaces. The manner and duration of contact also influence the amount of genetic material transferred. It has been demonstrated that DNA deposits increase when pressure or friction are involved, directly proportional to the intensity applied. So that could mean some interesting things for the sample size, especially if Kohberger is really who did it. He's a young male, so he likely sheds more. Also, he jogs and he hikes. He may have sweated more because of that. Now, it does talk about how on metal it might degrade faster. Now, we still don't know for sure whether that K-bar sheath had a brass snap or if it was coated with something. If it was coated with anything, like a coating, a paint or something, then it wouldn't degrade as fast. But I thought it was interesting that it also talks about pressure being applied, friction, because when you unsnap a snap, there's some friction there. So are more skin cells going to slough off than if you just touched it? I would think so, especially the ridge on the snap. So it's very possible that this touch DNA left behind was a larger sample than touch DNA that would have just been from picking up an item or sneezing near an item, for instance, because it sounds like this is epithelial cells that came off his finger when he opened and closed the snap. So it's interesting to think that, did the increased friction leave a bigger sample? Did he have sweat on his fingers that could have also left more DNA? Those are things we just don't know right now. But I think it's very premature for J. Embry to claim it was an incomplete sample because we just don't know. Another reason why I don't believe it was incomplete was it had the 20 loci required to enter into CODIS. As of 2017, the government has required 20 loci. It used to be 13. Now the loci are locations. It's where on the chromosome a gene is located. And it's requiring 20 of those genes to be put into CODIS. And what it did by going from 13 to 20 was keep up with international standards that are used in other countries, but also it reduces the risk of getting a false match, and it helps you get more accurate matches. So there's no reason to believe Kohberger's sample was incomplete. Also, the defense has never denied it's his DNA. And in fact, let's look at the defense's response to the prosecution's paperwork about the DNA. Okay, this was from the defense's response to the state's protection order about the DNA and the IgG. And it says, on November 20th, 2022, the Idaho State Police Lab in Meridian, Idaho, located DNA on the button of the sheath and performed STR analysis that led nowhere when ran through CODIS, other than to show it was a male. Now, they talk about the 2 additional male DNAs within the house and then the unknown on the glove. And it says, further, these 3 separate and distinct male DNA profiles were not identified through CODIS, leading to the conclusion that the profiles do not belong to Mr. Kohberger. Now, did you catch that part about the other male DNAs not matching to Kohberger and CODIS? You know why? First of all, I know Bill said that it was ineligible to run through CODIS. But it sounds like Anne is assuming that they ran them through CODIS, but they didn't match Kohberger. You know why? Because the DNA from the crime scene was in CODIS, which was Kohberger's DNA. So if those 3 unknowns didn't get a hit in CODIS, that's saying it wasn't Kohberger's, those 3 unknown, but it's also telling us Kohberger's was already in CODIS, which is true. Now, he was not in CODIS at the time that ISP ran the initial STR from the sheath because he had never committed an offense that would get him put into CODIS. But because he was the suspect DNA in the crime, which at the time they didn't know who he was, they just had this DNA from the knife sheath, it gets entered into CODIS. So not only do they run it to see if there's any matches, but then they enter it in there and say, this is the DNA of the believed suspect from crime scene, Moscow, Idaho, blah, blah, blah. Now it sits in CODIS. So it was input on November 20th. So when they got the dad's DNA out of the garbage in late December, and they made an STR profile of the dad, they got a partial match in CODIS. What that means is it was a family match. Partial match means they're hitting on a relative. This is different than the IgG. This is different from the SMP. This is STR in CODIS using those 20 genes, those 20 loci. It got a partial match. And it said that that match from the garbage could only be the father of the crime scene DNA. The crime scene DNA was the male offspring of the person from the garbage. So once they got that, they were able to confirm that it was Kohberger for sure. Because the IgG had given them the tip with his name. And then when they got the dad's garbage, there was the partial match. So then when they did the buccal swab, it was 100% match to Kohberger. That was in CODIS. Nobody did anything with it later. So Pavarotti claiming that they spliced the dad's genomes into the DNA from the crime scene is not feasible unless they had the dad's DNA back on November 20th of 2022 and spliced it into the crime scene profile, because that's when the DNA was entered into CODIS. The DNA from the crime scene, which turned out later to be Kohberger's, was entered into CODIS on November 20th. So unless they had the dad's genomes then, they didn't splice them in there. And how would they have the dad's genomes then if they hadn't identified Kohberger as the suspect yet? They didn't get the dad's DNA until late December. And then they ran it against what was already in CODIS from the crime scene. Partial match. Then when Kohberger was arrested, they ran his buccal swab against what was in CODIS. Complete match. Also, had they spliced the dad's genomes into that profile, you wouldn't have gotten a complete match for Kohberger. It wouldn't have come back a complete match for him if his dad's DNA had been spliced into it. So you are all kinds of off on this one. Again, as usual. But yeah, that's not what happened. And there's no indication it was an impartial profile, because they had enough to do an STR and then send to Othram for an SMP. Yes, I know they can do PCR, the amplification, but there's nothing that indicates they needed to splice anything in there. And especially his dad's genomes, because they wouldn't have had those anyway till after it was already entered into CODIS. So you make absolutely no sense. Please go back and reread these documents. Okay, now you also question why the trash was sent back to Idaho State Police Lab. That's because that's who had jurisdiction. FBI didn't have jurisdiction on this case. Now, the S&P was taken over by FBI, but Idaho police gave permission for that. If you read the documents, it says that they gave them permission to take that over. But the STR samples and all that was being handled by ISP, and that was their jurisdiction, so they weren't going to fly that to an FBI lab. And that goes into part of your chain of custody, because the same lab being consistent in doing it. That's just protocol. And something else that's just very telling, and I mentioned it earlier, Anne has never argued that that's not Brian's DNA. She's never said it's not him. She's just been trying to get the DNA off on a technicality by trying to say that the IgG was more than a tip and trying to get the STR even disqualified, but she has never come out and said that wasn't his DNA on the sheath. So I think that's very telling. And I would be very curious to know what their explanation is for how his DNA ended up on that sheath. The trial is going to be very interesting. Hope this helps. And again, if there's anything else you want me to cover, let me know.